But it is such a pleasure, nevertheless, and especially following our cold elections, and it's less embarrassing to be speaking to you from America at this point. So, okay, I'm going to go straight into and I wanted to begin just with a quote from Edouard Glissant as a kind of a base from some, for some of my work. And I'll just read. Western discoverers, explorers, merchants, conquerors, ethnologists, those men of intelligence, faith, and law. And I could, add in there, as part of the Western discoverers, artists as well. And so it's actually looking at the sort of knowledge creation by these discoverers, quote unquote, and what it means to be a practicing artist in the wake of their supposed discoveries. And I wanted to bring to your attention something that you're going to be much more familiar with than I am, the crest and motto of Imperial College. And 1908 on your left is 1908, the crest, and the change this year, actually. And here's the translation of the Latin, which is what they've taken off. So the scientific knowledge, the crowning glory and safeguard of the empire. So, it's so clearly points to what those discoveries were in service of. And it's taken to 2020. And the ongoing protests that have made Imperial College actually reconsider their motto. So it's really in relation to those histories of empire, and in particular, what I'm looking at, late 19th century, the period of what we might think of as high colonization, which is also its correlation of high European modernism, and I'm looking at the sort of the aftermath of that and how it plays out in the present. And so this is the book from 2018, How Art Can Be Thought. And I'm going to read just, I guess, 2 pages from that, just to give you a kind of broad sense of the scope of the book. And then hopefully Paul and I afterwards can get into conversation about some of the more specifics. So 2 aspects of colonization that I continually reference are its control over history, and in particular time and memory, and its exertions upon the body, and I look specifically at affect and mobility. Colonization aspires to determine history, controlling how time and the past are narrated in order to produce future narratives. It does so in part by creating a rupture from the past as well as within the present, a cut from any sense of historical continuity. Its capacity to wield these cuts is not only as an outside force, but also one that is fully embodied, psychically and physically acting upon and from within the body, forming how each one of us is organized, how and what we know, how we feel, think, and act in and with the world. That is, intimately producing any sense of who we are in relation to our history and to the bodies and histories of others. Intrinsic to who we are practices of both remembering and forgetting. Writing about the closed plantation system of the Americas, Edouard Glissant outlines how 2 cultures develop that are integral to modernism. One is a culture of actively forgetting. The other is one of remembering actively. And I'm deliberately linking this to activism. This remembering is undertaken at great risk against the strictures, impediments, and punishments imposed on remembering one's languages, one's histories, one's humanity, and the violence that has been perpetrated against those. Forgetting is also not a simple or lightly taken erasure, since it too is activist in its demands for returns to imagined pasts.
Da, fără bacon.
Sorry, I think someone has got their mic unmuted. Can you please mute your mic so we can continue the presentation? Thank you.
Not only brutal in its eradications, forgetting can entertain, or rather infotain, eventually producing, for example, and in the US context, the plantation as heritage tourist destination through the industry jargon of authentic recreations, of willing participation, of happy, cared-for slaves singing in the fields. Glissant reminds us that landscape, a supposedly neutral genre of nature observation, is highly implicated in this practice of forgetting, emphasizing the conventional splendor, quote unquote, of the Caribbean landscape over the lives and death grounds of slaves, an eviscerated landscaping that is integral to how contemporary tourists imagine themselves in that landscape, and how the imagining is enacted for them by the tourist industry. In this resort equivalent of terra nullius, the only natives are there to provide lux, calm et volupté, to quote Matisse's painting. The will to forget and the will to remember. How and what does one remember if a predominant modernism produces a culture of forgetting? How does art function as island of forgetting within seas of turmoil, as comfortable armchair, to keep Henri Matisse in mind, in the rooms of the living and the caverns of the dying? I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. The other main consideration I consider through colonization are control over mobility and access, of how emotions, languages, and ideas circulate, of which bodies have mobility and institutional access, including to ideas, and through which artistic practices and vocabularies these are extended and simultaneously withheld. Throughout the book, I return to these questions and what implications they have for looking at and understanding art, for pedagogy, and for social relations and disconnections developed around art. In doing this, I'm not prescribing what a decolonizing culture and its forms can or will be, since any such prescriptions should be suspect as returns to and applications of colonizing authority. My aim then is not to prescribe what art can be, but to work towards language to describe what it does and does not do, how it does that, and what it can do. Language being the prime means to articulate what those possibilities might be. Decolonizing culture and the modes of art political inquiry that I'm proposing cannot exist in isolation or with any claim to autonomy. They are entwined with and can only be experienced, understood, and enacted as decolonizing through arts institutions, practices, discourses, and participants. Like any other object or event, art and political work become politicized through the culture, agents, institutions, and systems that reproduce it and produce it, through which it operates and which it in turn produces. By returning to the political, and I concede that what the political means and how it functions are always contested and temporal. And in pulling from different sources, My interest is in placing a spectrum of ideas and practices in service of the idealism that many art students have and continue to have, often in more subdued form as artists. It's an idealism that desires more from art than being a commodity, that grounds art politically and socially while repurposing aesthetic and formal invention, that pursues art as complex intersections between individual and collective interests. It's an idealism that continues to inspire me, and yet it's an idealism that currently lacks an adequate language to articulate, investigate, and interrogate its interests, desires, demands, methods, and outcomes. So really that's the broad scope of the book. While my primary audience, and it's directed to MFA or Master of Fine Arts students and MA students, it really is for a general audience who is interested in looking at art and translating that looking and its effect upon the body and its effect upon the viewer, and translating that into language. And so that we actually begin to develop an adequate language for contemporary art in its transnational and international scope, rather than simply using the inherited language from European modernism. So I'm going to go through, give you some examples of how that's also how I approach my studio practice, as well as how I approach my writing. And I do talk about the book, How Art Can Be Thought as an Art Project. So just as an example, I'm going to proceed with the image from the book cover, which is taken from a series of one of my paintings, my series of paintings from the redaction series, and here's just an installation shot of the paintings, and just to give you a sense of the scale. And this is the painting that the book cover is derived from. It's from Henri Rousseau's Fight Between a Tiger and a Buffalo from 1908. And the redaction series are drawing from Rousseau and Gauguin, and again looking at that loose period from late 19th century to the early turn of the 20th century. And I was looking at Rousseau and Gauguin for the kind of visual vocabulary that they provide for colonialism and their depictions of the colonies. And Rousseau, because he never leaves France, and his source materials are really the zoo, the botanical gardens, the Natural History Museum, the Anthropological Museum in Paris. And so it's an indication of how the information from the colonies is reaching France in visual material form. And I look at Gauguin because he's always traveling and he goes to multiple French colonies. So this is the Rousseau painting, and this is my redaction of it. And I was thinking of redaction as a kind of a form of editing as well as an overlaying. And what I've done is I've taken the point in the painting, in Rousseau's painting, which is furthest away from the viewer. So in this case, the blue of the horizon line. And I've overlaid that color and the marks from that point of the painting onto the whole painting. So essentially turning it into a monochrome and flattening the painting, which was the kind of trajectory of European modernism anyway, towards the flat surface. And these are just details. And because I'm digitally choosing the color areas, the edges tend to be left intact. So if you know the painting, you can actually recognize it. So the original text is recognizable. It's just been redacted and overlaid. And that's really also how I've been approaching my use of text and how I've been writing. Is there's the sort of the underlay or the haunting of European modernism and its language, which I'm revising. Okay, so I'm going to move on through, and I'm going to move fairly quickly through these artworks so we can actually get to the conversation and Q&A. This is a work from, actually, when is it from? 2018, 2017 and 2018. And it was, I'd rewritten the travel journals of Henry Stanley and his discovery narratives of looking for the source of the River Nile. And so his expeditions in East Africa. And I rewrote those journals, those travel journals, so that it described an expedition to discover the source of the Thames. And the expedition takes place in 2016, in summer 2016, during the Brexit vote. And the expedition is conducted by Hafid Sidi Mubarak Mumbai, who is the great grandson of Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who's an actual historical figure and was the expedition guide for Henry Stanley. So this is Hafid Mumbai. And some of you might recognize the photograph. I actually rephotographed it from an exhibition in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And I've inserted one of my own works from the expedition, from the map of London. You'll also notice the Hafid's, the text on his turban is slightly altered. So the person in the photograph, the original historical photograph, is Major Musa, who was working for the Salvation Army in South Africa. And this is one of the transposition of Henry Stanley's text that describes the expedition in London. And I'll read it for those of you who are looking at this on maybe your tablets. So June 17th, the Brexit. The English have turned their backs on the modern world and its cosmopolitan exchanges, and have retreated into their tribal ranks. I find this narrow-mindedness unfathomable, and it must be surmised from their low intelligence. I fear their rejection of the outside world, their Brexit, will cause them to return to their nutritionally lacking traditional diet, whose evidence is painfully displayed in their sallow skin and poor dental health. It is a wonder that they have survived this long, though they have learned to consume and do so in great quantities, the foods such as curries and kebabs of other shores. So the text is admittedly offensive to the English. And when I have exhibited this, it was exhibited in New York and in California, and also in the Granite Museum in Illinois. I received emails about, obviously I'd never been, the artist must never have been to England because he's, they really don't know what England is really like. They don't know what great restaurants they are. The text is so offensive. And really that was my point, that we take offense when the text is describing the English, but the same text was actually used to describe Africans, and how little offense was taken at that particular text. Okay, so this is an installation view of the expedition artifacts, and there's a base camp. And on the walls are different maps, photographs, texts from the expedition. Another view, this is the back of the base camp. This is at another installation in California. And the base camp is really produced so it can be set up and taken down, so it's mobile. It consists of a kitchen area, a shower area. It has clothing. It's essentially in the form of a raft. Here you can see it's like a sort of multi-level condo or apartment complex. There's a bag of trading goods, trade goods which can be given out to the natives, natives quote unquote, and it consists of stuffed toys but have been literally skinned, turned inside out, and restuffed. You can also see, there's cooking utensils, which are all made out of duct tape. So they're in a constant state of repair and production. There's clothing there as well. And it's all powered by a rowing machine on this raft. And the rowing machine has these power boots, which can be plugged into the electricity. There's a detail. There's one of the images, a series of postcards, which is the crossing from Calais to Dover. And the text obviously is "Wish you were here," but truncated at either end. So these are one of the expedition maps, and you all know this map much better than I do. I should mention also, by the way, that I did grow up in London. I've spent half of my life in London. You'll also notice there's something wrong with, wrong quote unquote, wrong with the image. It's just that north and south are reversed. And the map is color coded. It's racially segregated, just based on the expedition's observations of who is occupying different neighborhoods. And there's a key on the right-hand side. You can see in the detail that the street names have actually been removed, although letters from the remnants of street names are left in there, almost as roadblocks or checkpoints. So it becomes a visual depiction of sort of navigating through those streets. Another map, and you can see it's actually the creases on the map. So this is from the actual brochure handed out when you go to London Zoo. I've added, or actually Hafid's added different, what we might consider trade goods, colonial raw materials, and so on. You can also tell north and south have been reversed by the direction of the East and the West Indies. So there's a detail. Most of that, safari, happy families, Africa, beach, paradise, that's from the actual brochure. And you can see the other editions, the colonial raw materials, cotton, slaves, diamonds, etc. have been added, souls, jute. Another map, Empire Gardens, you'll recognize it as Kew Gardens, with different overlays of the floating rectangles are the names of British explorers and if that was a world map superimposed, they're located in the areas that they're connected to in terms of where their expeditions took place. You'll also see the different monuments to different aspects of colonization, the financial center, the Gherkin, the monarchy, Buckingham Palace, the church, St. Paul's, image of the Solar Queen, etc., etc. Some detail. And this is a navigation chart, and again, you recognize it's the London tube map, but again reversed north and south, I've essentially, or just simply changed the name of every station to the name of someone who is really from the global south. A lot who have connections to England, but also international in scope. And in some ways, this not only refers to Hafid and the expedition, but it also refers to me personally, and is a much more of a personal navigation chart of people who've been politically and culturally, artistically important to me. And I'll show you a detail, or a couple of details, so you can see some of the names. You'll recognize different names. Many are specifically to do with London. Brenda Agard is there. Let's see who else is London-based. Polystyrene, who was who's Somali and was the lead singer of X-Ray Specs. Khadija Saye, who was killed in the Grenfell Towers. There are also people here who've been killed by the police. Stephen Lawrence, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, people who've been killed in transphobic, in homophobic attacks. You know, so people who've just been significant for the development, not only for my development, but for a sort of broader revision of how we can think about culture, and people who we're indebted to, and for me, people that in some ways I feel I have sort of debts of, well, simply debts, you know, to live up to in terms of what work I do. It's also a different mapping of how we can think of culture. So for example, the sort of bottom right, you know, the pink and sort of purple lines, you know, this prints, which gives us the purple color. But, you know, there are people who mostly we think of in relation to performance, music, you know, Freddie Mercury, Little Richard, Michael Jackson, Sylvester, dancers, you know, Josephine Baker. But I've also put Bruce Lee there, and Bruce Lee is a martial artist, but I also thought, well, you know, how would we think of Bruce Lee as a performer, as a movements artist, as a dancer? You know, how would we think of him in relation to someone like Josephine Baker? You know, even though that might sound anomalous to begin with, but I was trying to create different remappings across international lines and certainly crossing national and nationalist boundaries. So, for example, you know, in that sort of yellow-orange line at the bottom, you know, there are some people we associate with ska and reggae: Gregory Isaacs, Desmond Dekker, Dennis Brown. But I also have, you know, Bob Marley's there. I also put in Khalil Gibran. You know, how do we think of reggae artists as poets? You know, so it's also to rethink our notion of particular disciplines. Here, for example, there's Donald Rodney next to Rotimi Fani Coyote, next to Stuart Hall, who also lead to Jean-Michel Basquiat, then to Anne Chu, going up Rumana Hussein, also her strong connections with London, Ray Johnson, Carlos Villa, and so on and so on. Okay. A work from 2019, La Vida del Capitán. And this was a work that was sent in the mail to be exhibited initially in Seville. And it's an exhibit, it describes again a reverse expedition. It takes, it transcribes the ship's diaries from Christopher Columbus from 1492 and transposes it to describe an expedition from Calafia, California, to Seville and Spain. And Calafia is the word itself is from the Arabic, which has the same root as the word caliphate, as this sort of imagined utopian land. And my use of it is also to refer to it to the Spain as being part of the Moorish Empire at that point, and Columbus beginning his journey just after the reconquest by the Spanish monarchy. There's different images and texts which again narrate the ship journey from California to Seville, and each of these pieces then gets, it's printed, it's folded up, and sent in the mail to Seville, and gets opened up and displayed as we see in this exhibition. So I'm going to go through fairly quickly. This is just a translation of that text, and I showed it again, the work again in the US, and then provided a translation. So let me just read the beginning. The life of the captain, from the letters and journals of Visitação da Costa, a faithful Indian named after the captain's sister, traveling from Calafia on board the SS Margarita. In the name of Don Aldo, dear leader of the Twitters, perpetual viceroy and supreme governor of all hotels, golf courses and countries that he covets, makes deals with and occupies. So I'm conflating 1492 with the present. And I should add, the text is written by Visitação da Costa as a passenger on board the ship. And Visitação da Costa is also my mother's name. And she becomes the narrator of my most recent book, Arc of Martyrs. So there's a kind of entwining of autobiography as a way of socially, politically locating myself within these constructions of history and rewritings of history. Okay, so these are different accounts of the ship's journeys, and you can see the images actually refer to leaving Oakland, and then the travel to and crossing the Atlantic and arriving in Seville, and then photographs from the expedition of arrival, and then the descriptions as well of Seville. And again, all taken from Columbus's descriptions. And then the return journey back to Oakland, and we see the return takes place and the arrival where there's protests in 2016 against Trump. And then actually leaving Spain, you can see there's a rooftop which says "Occupy and Resist." Okay, so I'm going to come to Arc of Martyrs. And so this is the book cover, the front and the back. And you can read, I had the honor of getting these book blurbs from these 4 people, and I'll let you read them. Actually, maybe you can't read them, it might be too small. So Judith Butler says, a profoundly and provocatively subversive queering of contemporaneity and power. Like gender and its variants, this is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. Bad Pitt says, for example, at the bottom, who cares what I think? I'm a fucking actor. They hand me a script. I act. I'm here for entertainment. Okay. This is the way that the book is laid out. Joseph Conrad's text is on one side of the book, and my revision and rewriting is on the other side. And you can see it's an autobiography of V. And this is how the text is laid out. Oh, I just realized, you know, Paul, I'd set my alarm and I'd actually forgot to press play, so I don't know what that time is like.
Take your time, Alan. It's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And I'm going to end with this piece anyway. Actually, what I wanted to do is read from this text, and I'm going to read one paragraph. I'm going to read Conrad's version, and I'm going to ask you as viewers to read it to yourselves. And you can, you know, since you're all in your own spaces, feel free to read it aloud. But I want you to follow my voice, and so essentially it becomes a sound piece. And if you follow along with me, then you'll also get the sense of the rhymes, of how each word has been changed in order to create the rhyme. Okay, so I'm going to read just that first paragraph. And so I'm going to read the paragraph on the left, you're going to read the paragraph on the right. Okay, and let me take a sip of water first. Okay, at last we opened a reach. A rocky cliff appeared, mounds of turned up earth by the shore, houses on a hill, others with iron roofs amongst a waste of excavations or hanging to the declivity. A continuous noise of the rapids above hovered over the scene of inhabited devastation. A lot of people, mostly black and naked, moved about like ants. A jetty projected into the river. A blinding sunlight drowned all this at times in a sudden recrudescence of glare. There's your company's station, said the Swede, pointing to 3 wooden barrack-like structures on the rocky slope. I will send your things up. 4 boxes, did you say? So, farewell. Okay. So I'm going to come out of that. I think I've unshared, is that right?
Yes, you have. Have you finished, Alan, or do you?
I have. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Alan. That's such a rich presentation, and the way that you weaved discussions around the book with actually examples from your own work, and which I think is fascinating, and also the pièce de la résistance, which is a blurb from Brad Pitt. I mean, come on, Alan. That's pretty cool. Well, listen, we've got about 10 minutes left, and so you went slightly over, but that's fine,
Oh,
Alan, because I think it was really important to get that sense. I guess I'll just ask a couple of questions. While I'm doing that, please feel free, I'm talking to the audience, to just add some questions, and if we've got a few minutes, we can see if we can answer some of them. Okay, so we'll put them in the text, and I'll give you about 5 minutes at the end. We'll get a chance to answer some questions. But Alan, I guess. Just to go back to the book, How Art Can Be Thought, I think one of the reasons why I think this book is so important, I do think it's an important intervention, is that it kind of combines, a kind of theoretical critique of colonialism. And you've got some very important philosophical critiques of colonialism, of modernism, through the lens of people like Edouard Glissant, who's a favorite of mine, and many others, and questions around time and disruption, etc. But also based in a very pedagogical project. And obviously, you sit as chair and professor of art practice at at UC Berkeley. So this is a book that's written, from the art school and from within the institution. And you talk about the definition of art as being in and with. So I guess I'm really interested in what kind of pedagogy, because in a way the book is a pedagogical exercise as well as a philosophical exercise, I said. But I'm interested in it in terms of thinking about, for example, at UAL, University of the Arts, where I am, Chelsea, where I am based, where we're having discussions with, as many art schools are, about how to integrate questions of colonialism and decoloniality within the curriculum. So I'm just wondering, to me, this feels like a text which can be really important in addressing, artists' questions. I know that there's an important chapter, for example, around the critique, the crit, which feels like, and also a glossary of terms which students can use in the context of a crit and other forms of practice. So I guess just my question is, can you talk a little bit about because I know you wrote this book while you were chair. So tell me a little bit about how this book came about and what role it plays in your teaching and in the curriculum at UC Berkeley.
yeah. I mean, the book, as you mentioned, the bulk of the book is a glossary of terms, and it's the terms that are most commonly used by students to describe their work and the work of their peers, during critique. And often those terms are drawn from sort of popular culture of how people generally look at artworks. And one of the students pointed out that I make a face when certain works, I sort of grimace when certain words are used, because within the critique, we don't often have time to stop and hang on, let's examine the baggage of that term. Like, how is it being used here? How is it possibly opening up conversation, but also how is it also shutting down other kinds of conversation? And so I realized I can't just keep making faces. I actually have to provide time for how we address these terms. And so I began compiling a list. And at the beginning of semester, I would provide that list to students and say, these are the problematic terms, or that we need to discuss before we can proceed with critique. And it's from those discussions really that the book began to take shape. And that was over a number of years before I realized, oh, this needs to be a book. So it's really very student-centered. And in terms of being chair, because of the amount of admin work we have to do, and as well as our teaching, as well as kind of shaping the program, I do think it was the only kind of book I could have done while doing that other work, because it was exactly in line with trying to imagine what this department could be, what our curriculum should be moving towards. And so it was definitely to try and provide a methodology and a template. And that's why it's a handbook. it's to provide a methodology, I think. So it's not to say this is how you should do it, but it's like, let's break down the kind of existing system that we are using.
Just a quick follow-up to that, Alan. I mean, how has it been adopted? Has it been adopted by the, you know, how has it landed in the school, and how has it kind of influenced the way that your studio teaching, for example?
It's harder for me to use it directly. You know, I don't want to say to my students, okay, you have to buy my book before you can work with me. You know, so I don't do that. But certainly other schools are using it. And I do provide my grad students at least a chapter on critique. Like, you know, you need to read this before we actually begin critique, because otherwise we're just repeating ourselves too much. It's interesting, you know, we can get into marketing, that Amazon, for example, lists it mostly as a book on museum studies. You know, so I think because how the title, How Art Can Be Thought, and A Handbook for Change, doesn't mention specifically pedagogy. It doesn't mention, you know, decolonization. And so those are interesting marketing questions, which, you know, I'd never considered in my writing. And so it's sort of harder to track in one sense of how it's being used, but, you know, except by word of mouth.
Sure. We've got a few questions coming up. So, Alan, so can I just give you some of them? There's 4 questions at the moment. So if I maybe just sort of give you them and maybe you can respond. The first was a question from Akim, who says, can you be so kind to repeat the references for these quotes from How Art Can Be Thought to be able to reread them more easily? So there's a question about some of the references you used. The second question was from Kate, who says, a fascinating presentation, thank you so much. Can you explain the importance of colour in your work? There's a question about colour. The first one was about references. The third one was from Sophia, who is Dean of Art here at Chelsea. She says, yes, agreed, Paul, to my comment about the curriculum. The text regarding art beyond the commodified context as a socio-political intersectional critique, beautifully articulated. I guess that's more of a comment rather than a question. And a question from Michael, who I think is the Michael who works at TrAIN, who helped organise this event. He says, can artists or art critique a system that supports it? And why does the system support its critics? This is definitely Michael. Capitalists supporting Marxist artists, as an example. So there's a few questions there. One, some references to colour in your work. A comment about, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to, with the references, I'm going to be mean and basically just say buy the book. Everything's footnoted.
You can download, actually, if you're a student at UAL, you can actually get it in the library online, and it's an downloadable ebook. But if you're not, you can also, you can download, anyone can download the first chapter from the Duke University Press website.
Yeah, and actually that should have the references. Yeah. So color, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, certainly being a student, you know, originally in England, you know, I did my foundation at Goldsmiths, and then my BA at Bath. You know, you kind of get told that color is like, first of all, it's ugly. It's like you don't have a color sense. And I was told that all the way through high school. You have no sense of color. You don't know how colors work together. And the same with pattern. You know, like there's too much decoration here. And of course that's a sort of deliberate denigration of but also indicative of the sort of predominance of the influence of minimalism with that sort of 70s and 80s generation of teachers. And so that sort of almost like Protestant aesthetic of, you know, let's just get rid of color, and the sort of philosophical argument was that we're getting back to essentials and to the sort of essence of what's important. Without realizing that actually color and pattern are much more complex ways of organizing, you know, our sort of visual fields. So for the example of, you know, black and white photography is somehow seen to be more authentic, whereas, you know, in its removal of color, it's actually, it's an abstraction. And, you know, so the way that color is so often associated, you know, with, in the US context, people of color, or, you know, or black and Asian people, working class people, with women, with queer people, you know, so it's all those groups who are seen as marginal, and those aesthetics of those groups are therefore seen as marginal as well. So, you know, color is highly politicized, and, you know, the arguments around it are highly politicized. Let's see. Question. Oh, can artists critique a system that support them? Artists are particularly well placed because they're insiders to the systems that support them. They're the ones who should be making those critiques, because we're the ones who understand how those systems work. You know, you can't really adequately critique a system from outside, simply because of not knowing exactly how the systems function. And if we're the recipients, or the beneficiaries, as well as the ones excluded from those systems, you know, and for me to become chair of a department, you know, it's also a position of responsibility that to enable others to be able to get into these positions as well, in order to continue critiques, because those critiques, you know, as I mentioned when I was first reading, things become politicized by the people and the institutions, the actors who actually conduct the critiques. You know, political work doesn't take place within a vacuum. It's by who enacts it. And so we're the ones who are placed within the systems who can critique it, and therefore have an obligation and responsibility to conduct those critiques.
Great. Apparently that wasn't Michael from TrAIN. It was another Michael. So sorry, Michael, the guest who asked that question. Another question from Una. We'll probably go on for another 4 or 5 minutes, because we're now at 7 o'clock in the UK. So Una says, what is the significance of language and sound in your work, Allan? And her interest here is in the ambiguity of language and music without words.
Yeah, thanks, Una. But you know, language, you know, there is an autobiographical element, and you know, I do talk about the use of autobiography, not simply to tell my story, and certainly not to authenticate myself, but to sort of place myself politically and socially as a way for me to then begin to examine the sort of culture that I'm functioning within, and to be able to examine the sort of the inheritances of culture. And so that autobiographical link is partly for me coming to England, and what it means to relearn a language. You know, I was raised speaking English as one of 3 languages, and so I never had the issue of having to learn English from scratch, but I suddenly had to learn a different kind of English. I had to suddenly remake or change my accents. And so it's the remaking of language and translation. Also, what doesn't get translated, what can't be translated, what gets invented through translation, And also when we translate something, how we remake not only the language, but how we remake the place where we're now in through our acts of translation. And for me, that was the sort of beginning importance of language, and of course sound, and certainly that, you know, I relate that to musicality, and because part of the relearning of language is through the sound of it, and I use the example of dictation, of how, particularly in England, you know, where we're learning another language, you know, through the practice of dictation, where the teacher reads something aloud and students then have to write it down in that language, and so then we're translating how we receive the sound. And within that practice of dictation, there seems such a huge area of deliberately mishearing and recreating language through that deliberate, intentional act of mishearing. And that's how I approached the rewriting of Joseph Conrad, as a kind of intentional mishearing.
Thank you so much, Alan. We are over time. Thank you so much, everyone, for keeping with us. Well, I'll just allow one more question and one comment. The comment is from Ian. He says Bruce Lee was a ballroom dancer in his youth, so it's not so far-fetched to think of him as alongside Josephine Baker in relation to your map. So I think it's a great comment. And then one from our mutual friend, Alia Syed, the artist, a filmmaker. Hi, Alan. Really enjoyed your presentation. I've been skimming through your book. I loved so much of it, especially the glossary, which is at times hilarious. Could you talk a bit about the use of humor in the work?
Okay, thanks, Alia. Hi. Yeah, humor, you know, it's certainly it's one of the pleasures of art making, and so for me, and just going back to those questions around sound and color, that these were pleasures, and going through art school, they were some of the pleasures that were denied, or there was an active denying of those pleasures to me, and so there was always a resistance from me to kind of maintain those pleasures of being able to use sound and color, and humor, and of course when one remakes language and mishears it, inevitably, you know, it raises the all those kinds of possibilities of punning on language, of sort of spoonerisms, of mishearing things, of alliterations and so on. You know, I do think of political humor as well in relation to satire. I think of drag, I think of the carnival as kind of as humor that's directed against power. And so, yeah, humor is, you know, I think is really an important part of being able to speak back, because it also allows, I think, certain kinds of language we can address what is seen as difficult subject matter through humor, which we might not be able to otherwise address. You know, so I think that humor is also a kind of avenue, as it provides opportunities of being able to speak.
Great. Una says, Alia mentioned irreverence as being a factor in this, and then Una says, this is perhaps where poetry and metaphor becomes real, as a question. Alan, I think we're going to draw to an end. It feels as though, you know, the presentation was so rich, and there's so much more we could have spoken about, and I feel that perhaps we need to kind of do another conversation at some point.
Yeah, I know, Paul.
Kind of,
you know, you and I, we also
continue the dialogue. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we have so many connections. You know, and as you mentioned,
yeah,
I have a grounding in England through the Black Arts movement.
Yeah, and
This,
exactly. There's so much we could talk about, but we will do that, Alan. We'll continue that. But before I say thank you to you, I wanted to just say thank you to all of the TrAIN team that helped put this together. That's Evelina Warner, Maribel Hidalgo Urbanesha, Richard Coles, who helped us with the technical side, and Michael Asbury, who I thought asked that question about artists in capitalism, but he didn't. So obviously, Alan, thank you so much. I know it's like 10 o'clock in the morning when we started. For you, you've really helped us to think through these questions. Your book is an important intervention that I think deserves to be widely read. If Brad Pitt is reading it, then hey, I mean, you can't get a better. That alone is gonna, really. No, but seriously, the book is a really important intervention, and I think it's a very unique one. It needs to be taken seriously. Duke University Press, 2018, How Art Can Be Thought, and also Arc of Martyrs as well. So please go out and get that. Our next TrAIN event. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the date. It will be in December, early December. I think it might be the 9th of December. Please look at the website. And it will be with Russian-Dutch artist Glukia about the politics of fashion, which will be really exciting with one of our TrAIN members, Georgia Bartlett from London College of Fashion. So thank you so much, Alan, for your time. Thank you for everyone for joining us. There's still 66 of you online, even though we're 10 minutes over. And please come back and look out for the next TrAIN Open series. And Alan, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much. My alarm just went off for the end of my speaking time. But thank you so much. Great. It was a pleasure, a real treat for me.